The letter felt heavier than it should have, like bad news had soaked into the paper itself. David tore it open right there by the mailbox, his fingers already tense. The words hit him like a punch to the stomach. After a review of community boundaries, your back acre has been reclassified as common property. He read it again and again. But no matter how many times his eyes traced the lines, the meaning didn't change. They were taking his land. That acre wasn't just dirt and grass. It had been in his family for 3 generations. His grandfather had planted the old oak tree that still stood tall near the creek. His dad had built the fence himself, measuring every inch to make sure it stayed within their property lines. David had spent summers there as a kid, running through the field, climbing the same tree his father once had. Now, the HOA was acting like it never belonged to them in the first place. He rushed inside, flipped open his laptop, and pulled up the property tax records. He'd been paying for that land. 15 years of taxes, no disputes, no warnings, nothing. But now, out of nowhere, the HOA had decided it was theirs? David didn't waste time stewing over it. He grabbed his keys and marched straight to Eleanor Winter's house. She had only been HOA president for a few months, but she had already made it clear she liked power. Her yard was immaculate, not a single weed in sight, the kind of perfection that screamed control. She answered the door in workout clothes, her hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail. When she saw him, she didn't even look surprised. "Can I help you, David?" Her voice was polite, but her eyes held nothing but boredom. He held up the letter. "This says you're taking my land. There must be some mistake." Eleanor didn't even glance at the paper. She just smiled, the kind of smile people use when they're pretending to be nice. "No mistake. The HOA had a professional survey done. Your grandfather's old maps were incorrect." David clenched his jaw. "I've been paying taxes on that land for years." She shrugged, inspecting her nails like the conversation was wasting her time. The HOA bylaws don't require notification for property corrections. And honestly, you'll love what we have planned. A beautiful resort-style pool, cabanas, even a cocktail bar. It's going to raise property values for everyone, including you. David barely heard the rest. A pool, a bar, cabanas on his land. This wasn't some clerical error. It wasn't an honest mistake. It was a scheme. But if Eleanor thought he was just going to roll over and accept it, she was in for a surprise. She had no idea he had already started planning his next move. David was still fuming over his conversation with Eleanor when he noticed something strange. His neighbors, Tyler and Samantha Morgan, had just finished building a pool, right near his property line. It hadn't been there a month ago, and now, all of a sudden, there was a full setup with lounge chairs and a fancy deck. He wouldn't have thought much of it, except for one detail. The Morgans had barely spoken to him since the HOA's letter arrived. At a neighborhood party that weekend, the tension was obvious. Conversation stopped when he walked by. People whispered, avoiding eye contact. Something was off. When David finally cornered Tyler near the drink table, his neighbor barely hid his guilt. "It's not personal, man," Tyler muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "Eleanor just showed us the new property lines. We thought you knew." David gritted his teeth. So, the HOA had told the neighbors before even informing him. They had been making plans for weeks, probably months, acting as if the land was already theirs. They weren't just taking it. They were building on it. Back home, David pulled out his grandfather's old land deeds and laid them side by side with the HOA's so-called official survey. The differences were impossible to miss. His grandfather's maps followed natural landmarks, the creek, the oak tree, the rocky ridge, clear markers that had always defined the property. But the HOA's new survey? straight, artificial lines that cut through his most valuable acre. It was as if they had drawn the map to fit their plan, ignoring the actual land itself. He had suspected something shady. Now he had proof. The HOA wasn't wasting time either. The next morning, a community-wide message hit his inbox. Groundbreaking for the Pinecrest Resort begins next Tuesday. Please remove all personal belongings from the designated area. 5 days, that was all he had before bulldozers rolled onto his land and destroyed everything his family had built. David needed help, fast. He grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the name, James Jacobson. James had worked with his father years ago, surveying properties across the county. If anyone could help him prove the HOA's map was a fraud, it was James. While waiting for Jacobson's reply, David called his cousin Vince, who worked at the county records office. If the HOA had messed with official boundaries, the original files would prove it. Vince agreed to meet him after hours, and by that evening, they were knee-deep in dusty records. And that's when David found it. The 1952 County Survey. It didn't just confirm that his land extended further than he thought. It proved the HOA's new map was completely fake. The real boundary stretched well beyond what Eleanor had claimed. But that wasn't even the biggest discovery. The ridge behind his land, the one the HOA planned to bulldoze for their resort. It had once been classified as a potential archaeological site. Jacobson pulled up early the next morning, his truck packed with surveying equipment. He climbed out, holding a metal detector in one hand and a coffee in the other. "Let's find out just how bad they screwed up," he said, already getting to work. David led him to the back acre, where the grass had grown wild over the years. His grandfather had once maintained this land carefully, but after his passing, life got in the way. Now, the overgrowth worked in their favor. It meant no one had tampered with the original boundary markers. Jacobson moved methodically, sweeping the metal detector over the ground. It wasn't long before the device let out a sharp beep. "There's something here," he muttered, dropping to his knees. He dug carefully, brushing away dirt and roots. A few minutes later, he sat back on his heels, holding up a rusted survey stake. David exhaled. Proof. They kept going, moving along the property line, searching for more. By sunset, they had found 3 more markers, all confirming the same thing. His land extended even further than he thought. And the best part? The HOA's fake boundary wasn't just stealing his acre. The Morgans' fancy new pool was sitting right on his land. David stared at the freshly poured concrete, the expensive lounge chairs, the poolside bar. It was almost funny. Tyler and Samantha had built their luxury setup on property they didn't even own. Jacobson let out a low whistle. They're in for a nasty surprise. But the real shock came a few minutes later. While sweeping near the rocky ridge, Jacobson's metal detector beeped again. But this time, it wasn't picking up survey markers. David knelt beside him as Jacobson carefully dug through the dirt. Something small and hard surfaced. It wasn't a rock. It was shaped too perfectly, smoothed by time. Jacobson turned it over in his hand. This looks like an arrowhead," David frowned. "Like an old one?" Jacobson nodded. "And if there's one, there's more." They dug deeper, uncovering 2 more arrowheads and a fragment of pottery. David's mind raced. His grandfather had once told stories about finding artifacts on the land when he was young. At the time, David thought it was just one of those things old men said to impress kids. But it wasn't a story. It was real. And now, it could change everything. Later that evening, David knocked on his neighbor Rose's door. She was in her 70s now, but she used to be a history teacher and had spent years volunteering at the local museum. If anyone could help, It was her. Rose listened carefully as David explained everything. The stolen land, the fake survey, the artifacts. When he finished, she gave him a knowing smile. "Eleanor's been pulling stunts like this for years," she said, "but this time she went too far. She didn't just agree to help, she jumped in head first." Rose dug through her old contacts, calling in favors, while David and Jacobson documented everything. They took photos of the markers, time-stamped their findings, and filed an official report. Meanwhile, Vince kept digging through county records, searching for any connection between Eleanor and the development company behind the resort. The text he sent David the next morning nearly made him drop his coffee. "Got her. Eleanor's husband is CFO of Lakeside Developments. They just submitted plans for vacation rentals near our neighborhood." David stared at the message. Now he understood why Eleanor was pushing so hard for this project. It wasn't just about a pool, it was about money. With everything in place, David filed an emergency historical preservation request with the county. The second it was processed, construction on his land had to be paused until a full review was completed. The trap was set. Now all he had to do was wait for the HOA to walk right into it. David was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when his phone buzzed. He squinted at the screen, expecting another message from Vince or Rose, but what he saw made his heart pound. "Meeting tomorrow 7 a.m. at Eleanor's house. Bringing contractors to mark pool placement on David's acre. Don't tell him." Whoever sent the text had clearly meant it for someone else. They weren't waiting until Tuesday. They were moving up the timeline. David sat up, adrenaline kicking in. They thought they could pull this off before he had time to stop them. They had no idea how ready he was. He immediately called Jacobson. "We need to be out there before they are," he said. "Bring the flags." By 5 a.m., the two of them were working in the dark, marking the real boundary lines with bright orange stakes. The morning air was cold, the grass damp with dew, but neither of them cared. They hammered in the last stake just as the first car pulled up. David and Jacobson hid behind the shed, watching as Eleanor arrived with 3 HOA board members and a group of contractors. A truck rolled in, loaded with spray paint, stakes, and measuring tools. Eleanor walked onto the land like she already owned it, her voice loud and confident. "The spa will go here," she announced, gesturing to an open spot. David's stomach twisted. She was standing right in his grandmother's old rose garden. That was it. David stepped out, phone in hand, camera rolling. "Good morning, Eleanor," he called. The entire group froze. Eleanor turned, her usual fake smile plastered on her face. "David," she said smoothly, "we're just marking the area for community improvements." He pointed to his bright orange stakes. "Funny, because those markers show my actual property lines, and you're about 10 feet over them." The contractors exchanged looks. They weren't getting paid enough to deal with legal issues. Eleanor's smile flickered. "This is HOA-approved land." David held up his phone, making sure to capture Eleanor directing the workers to spray paint a property that wasn't legally theirs. "That's interesting," he said, "because I've got county records, survey markers, and historical preservation requests that say otherwise." Eleanor's jaw tightened, but before she could say anything, another car pulled up. Sheriff Davis. He stepped out, adjusting his belt as he looked around. "Got a report of unauthorized construction," he said. His gaze landed on the half-painted markings and stakes littering David's land. "Someone want to explain what's going on?" Eleanor recovered quickly. "Sheriff, we're simply making improvements for the community." David didn't even need to argue. He just handed over his folder of evidence, official property records, historical reports, photos of the original survey markers. The sheriff flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable. Then, he closed the folder and turned to Eleanor. "You can't build here," he said flatly. "Not until this is sorted out." Eleanor's face went red. "This is ridiculous. He's just stalling. Doesn't matter." The sheriff cut her off. "Legally, construction has to stop." He turned to the contractors. "Pack it up." The workers didn't hesitate. They had no interest in being dragged into an HOA lawsuit. They loaded up their gear, leaving Eleanor fuming as David watched, arms crossed. Round one, won. But David knew it wasn't over. The HOA wasn't going to give up that easily. By that evening, an emergency HOA meeting was called. The official announcement claimed it was to clear up misinformation about the Pinecrest Resort project. David knew better. When he walked into the meeting, the tension in the room was thick. Over 100 neighbors had shown up. Some looked curious, others worried. Tyler and Samantha sat near the front, avoiding his gaze. Eleanor stood at the podium, her hands gripping the sides. "We've had a slight delay," she began, forcing a smile. "But let's not be distracted by false claims. The board stands by our survey, which was conducted by professionals." David walked straight to the front and set down his own pile of documents. "Before you keep lying," he said, "you might want to explain why your survey was done by your brother-in-law's company." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Eleanor's smile vanished. David continued, flipping to another page. "And since we're talking about facts, let's discuss what was actually found on my land." He pulled out a plastic evidence bag containing an arrowhead. "The County Historical Society has already reviewed this. It's real. And under state law, you can't build a resort or anything on a protected archaeological site." The room exploded with whispers. Several board members looked at each other, uneasy. David glanced over at Eleanor. She was silent. For the first time, she didn't have a response. Then, one of the board members stood. "I move that we re-evaluate this entire project before making any final decisions." Another quickly agreed. Within seconds, the momentum had shifted. The same people who once backed Eleanor were now scrambling to distance themselves. Eleanor's grip tightened on the podium. Her voice was quieter this time, but full of anger. "This isn't over," David smirked. "I didn't think it was." Eleanor wasn't done yet. Even with the board turning on her, even with the sheriff shutting down construction, she still thought she could claw her way out. At the next HOA meeting, she came in ready for a fight. Dressed in sharp business attire, she stood before the crowd with a stack of papers in her hands. "David has misled all of you," she declared, her voice steady but strained. "His so-called evidence? Completely fabricated." She held up a document. "This is a review from an independent expert stating that those artifacts could have been planted." David didn't flinch. He had been expecting something like this. Before he could even respond, a voice from the crowd cut through the tension. It was Tyler Morgan. He stood up slowly, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Eleanor, stop," he said. "We all know what you've been doing." He turned to the board. "I have something you should see." He walked to the front and set down a thick folder. Emails, documents, property records. "These are the fake property adjustments Eleanor gave me months ago," he admitted. "She told us the land was already approved for the resort, told us to move forward with our renovations because it was a done deal." He looked at David. "I believed her. I was wrong." Eleanor's face went pale. The HOA lawyer, who had been sitting stiffly at the table, suddenly stood up. He adjusted his tie, leaned over to Eleanor, and whispered something in her ear. Then, without another word, he grabbed his briefcase and walked straight out of the room. He knew this was over. The board didn't even have to deliberate for long. Eleanor's actions had put them all at risk. Potential lawsuits, fraud accusations, financial disaster. They had no choice. A motion was put forward. A vote was taken. Eleanor Winters was officially removed from the HOA board. Then came the second vote, to return all stolen land to its rightful owners. That one passed even faster. David didn't expect what happened next. Several board members turned to him, one clearing his throat awkwardly. "We need someone to oversee property disputes from now on," he said. "We'd like you to join the Architectural Review Committee." David glanced around the room. For the first time since this nightmare started, he wasn't the enemy anymore. The same people who had ignored him, doubted him, were now looking at him with something close to respect. He agreed, not because he wanted power, but because he wanted to make sure this never happened again. 6 months later, Eleanor's house was put up for sale. She didn't stick around after her downfall. With her reputation ruined, the HOA seat gone, and her husband's development project dead in the water, she had nothing left to keep her here. The Morgans, to their credit, owned up to their mistake. They apologized to David and even paid to fix the damage done to his land. And his land? Now officially protected as a historical site, that meant no HOA, no developer, no one could ever touch it again. David stood on his back acre one evening, watching the sun dip below the trees. The same land his grandfather had walked, the same land his father had protected, was finally safe. He smiled to himself. Sometimes the best way to beat your enemy isn't through anger, it's through patience. And if you let them, they'll set the perfect trap for themselves.